Hello everyone and welcome to the Mash and Drum Whiskey Room and What's on the Shelf Wednesday. I am Jason C. and in this series I do quick reviews of whiskeys that you could find on the shelf, including bourbons, rye, Irish whiskeys, and scotch. So what's on the shelf today? None other than Ezra Brooks Bourbon. In the world of bottom shelf whiskey, Ezra Brooks Bourbon is a brand that seems to always be there. The Ezra Brooks brand was created by Frank Silverman in 1957 and was bottled at the Hoffman Distilling Company in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, up until Hoffman Distilling Company went out of business in the 1970s. Fast forward to 1993, Ezra Brooks was purchased by Luxco of St. Louis, Missouri, formerly the David Sermon Company, renamed in 2006. Ezra Brooks is supposedly sourced from Heaven Hill, but given we are looking at a younger bourbon in the bottle, I wouldn't be surprised if Luxco is close to or is starting to add their own distillate into Ezra Brooks themselves. Ezra Brooks is one of the featured brands under Luxco's Lux Row Distillers, which is located in Bardstown, Kentucky, along with Luxco's other whiskey brands, Rebel Yell, David Nicholson, and also Blood Oath. Now, this bourbon gets a charcoal filtering before bottling, which should not be confused with the Lincoln County process used in Tennessee, which is done before it even goes in the barrel. Now, the reason I bring up the Lincoln County process is because one of my favorite historical stories has to do with the legal case of Jack Daniel's Distillery, Inc. versus Hoffman Distilling Company, which tells you the story how Frank Silverman created a brand without a distillery in 1957, which he called the Ezra Brooks Distilling Company. So you guys know I love my bourbon history, and I read the story in the amazing book by Brian Harrah here called Bourbon Justice: How Whiskey Law Shaped America. If you're a bourbon nerd like me, then this is a must read, but the story of Jack Daniel's versus Hoffman Distilling was one that stuck out to me here in the book. So as Brian mentions in the book, Frank Silverman created the Ezra Brooks brand without a distillery in 1957. Frank sourced bourbon from the Hoffman Distilling Company in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky, which at the time was part of the famous Rippey family. Now, Hoffman Distillery was also recognized as the early bottling location for Pappy Van Winkle after Julian Van Winkle renamed it Commonwealth Distillery, and where other assumed names for bottling purposes have included A.H. Hirsch, Old St. Nick, Michter's, and Black Maple Hill. According to the book and to the court filings, Frank also sourced from other distilleries in addition to the Hoffman Distillery, but Ezra Brooks was bottled in its early days at that Hoffman Distillery. Now, Frank was able to get his new brand to the market by April 1957, just in time to take advantage of a shortage of Jack Daniel's. It was clear to the court that Frank intentionally copied and imitated the appearance of the well-established and attractive Jack Daniel's Black Label package and advertising techniques for its new and unknown brand, Ezra Brooks. Frank didn't just try to make his new brand look similar to Jack Daniel's, he blatantly copied and imitated the popular brand as much as he could, and it's something I never noticed until I really read the book. So when it comes down to the checklist, you have a square bottle, check. Blank and white strap around the label, check. Pictures of an old-timey distillery, check. He even added the language on his label that said real sippin' whiskey. The big key to all this is through an investment of $3.5 million, Jack Daniel's increased its sales by 900% between 1950 and 1956, when it was purchased by Brown-Forman at the time. Now, the surge in demand actually created a legitimate shortage by 1957, and Jack Daniel's had to allocate their whiskey. And that was another thing highlighted on his bottles of Ezra Brooks as well, saying there isn't quite enough to go around compared to what Jack Daniel's said on their bottle, there just ain't enough to go around. This was the original Apple versus Samsung. Amazingly though, Frank's lack of originality and his copycat mentality were not enough to win the lawsuit for Jack Daniels. The court ruled and was upheld on appeal that because Frank used a completely different name for his brand, and because the source Tennessee versus Kentucky was clearly marked on the labels, Jack Daniels could not prove that Frank was unfairly attempting to pass off Ezra Brooks as Jack Daniels. Like, what? After that, Frank doubled down on saying his bourbon was limited to drive demand and built his brand before eventually the Ezra Brooks brand was passed on around the industry and to different ownership, including Jim Beam, Julius Weil Sons and Company, Medley Distilling, and now Luxro. It's a crazy story, but one you can appreciate knowing there are still new bourbon brands today that will manufacture a history to sell their whiskey. All right, so I hope you guys enjoy that little story of history. Now to the review for today's Ezra Brooks. This is bottled at 90 proof, charcoal filtered, has a mash bill of 78% corn, 12% rye, 10% malted barley. It's about 4 years old plus and sells for about 12 to 15 bucks. So recently I did a live stream where I put a bunch of bottom shelf bourbons in a blind flight. I did about 6 or 7 different ones, and Ezra Brooks was the one that came out on top. So I figured let's give it a full review for what's on the shelf Wednesday, because it's one that's always on the shelf. So let's get into the nose. Yeah, this definitely smells a little bit like Heaven Hill. It has a Cracker Jack type nose to it. I'm talking very sweet corn, very light caramel. There's a tad bit of oak there, not a lot though. There's a hint of cinnamon, a hint of like orange spice as well. Definitely get your vanillas there, but again, these are lighter bourbon notes. Yeah, I think what stood out for me on this one when compared to the other ones I was tasting was the balance of it. It's not really over the top one way or the other. It's not gonna blow you away on the nose, but I think being 90 proof compared to the others that were all pretty much 80 proof, you know, for the price, it really stood out above the rest. So let's go for a sip. Cheers. Yeah, if there's one particular word that you can attribute to Ezra Brooks, it's balance. You get the sweetness up front, you get the vanilla, the caramels, little hint of a toffee note there that I'm getting too, which is really nice. When I'm tasting it just by itself, instead of against all these other bourbons, you know, different flavors start to, you know, make themselves known because they're not distracted by other ones you just tasted. But it's really good. I like the sweetness of it. I like the balance, a little bit of oak. Definitely get that orange spice. I love the toffee note on there. Let's go for another sip. You know what, this reminds me a little bit of the old Heaven Hill Bottled and Bond, the 100 proof, the beloved 6-year, the white label that was discontinued. Obviously it's a little less flavorful than that, but it definitely has that Cracker Jack, the caramel, the vanilla, a little bit of orange spice to it that reminds me a little bit what was in that bottle, which makes sense considering this is from Heaven Hill. Let's go for another sip. We just got a little bit more oak in there on the back end. Good spice too, that cinnamon is really starting to, it's like a cinnamon black pepper mix on the back end. I really like the sweetness too and the balance. I really love the vanilla and the caramel up front. There's that nice little orange spice mid-palate. The thing that's winning it for me is that little bit of a toffee note. Really don't get much of a charcoal type of aspect to it, but you know, it does drink very sweet, very smooth, very easy. It's 90 proof, but it's very sweet, very balanced. One last sip here, cheers. Wow, the more I drink this, the vanilla and the caramel is actually starting to take a back seat to the orange spice and the toffee, which I actually really like. So I think this kind of gives you some different flavors as you keep sipping on it. Now again, this is 90 proof. It's about 12 to 15 bucks for a bottle, which is an amazing price. I love the balance of it for the price, and I think it definitely exceeded my expectations when I compared it to other bottom shelfers. So again, when I compared this, I had it against Benchmark 8, Ancient Age, a couple of other bottom shelfers, but some pretty well-known bourbons from the bottom shelf, and this one really stood out. I think for $12, $15, look, obviously it's not gonna stand up to other bourbons on the shelf when you compare it to Elijah Craig or Knob Creek or Four Roses or Wild Turkey. It just doesn't have that type of a flavor punch or age to it. Yeah, if you haven't tried Ezra Brooks, I think you'd be surprised at how balanced and how flavorful it is for the price. If any of you out there are sick of, you know, trying to find higher age stuff or higher price stuff, you just want something cheap, easy, that will give you some good bourbon flavor, then I think I would take Ezra Brooks over a lot of the ones out there that are on the shelf, including Benchmark 8, Ancient Age. This one just has a lot of flavor. Again, it's sourced by Heaven Hill, so if you like that Heaven Hill, that Cracker Jack, and those flavors, the vanilla, the caramel, a little bit of orange spice, I think you'll really enjoy this. Give it a shot. If not, to drink it straight, try it as a mixer. It's really good in that way too. All right, guys, well, hope you enjoyed this review of Ezra Brooks in today's episode of What's on the Shelf Wednesday. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit that subscribe button below. Please hit that like button. If you haven't yet, follow me on Instagram and follow me on Twitter. Always love hearing from you. Let me know what you think of Ezra Brooks if you've had it, since it's been owned by Luxco. And as I always say, it's not about the whiskey, it's the people you share it with. So cheers, and I'll see you next time on The Mash and Drum. Take care.